and welcome to the Green Canary, the environment news podcast where we bring you the latest on everything to do with the environment, climate, energy, and the politics around it all. I'm Elfie Scott, I'm a journalist, a writer, and I hope you're having a lovely holiday break. I'm sitting across from the wonderful Ant Sharwood, as always.
Does that mean I'm wonderful as always, or as always you're sitting opposite the wonderful me? Doesn't matter. I'm Ant. I'm a journo. I'm an author. Sometimes I'm wonderful, sometimes not so much. If you're listening to this now, please send jelly snakes because I'm in the middle of the Jagungal wilderness in the middle end of Kosciuszko National Park. So that's...
I'm sending you my prayers, Ant.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So what do we got today, Elfie? It's a different summary podcast, isn't it?
It is. So today we've got a bit of a different show from the usual breakdown of the news for you. As all of us on the East Coast are probably already aware, we are well and truly in a La Niña weather phase, which generally means warmer than average sea surface temperatures near Australia. And that in turn causes more moisture, more wet air. I want to say wet air, but that sounds weird.
Moisture-laden, they say in meteorology.
Oh, moisture-laden. I'm going to go with wet air.
Please.
Scientists, don't tell me what to say.
Okay.
To flow, and that's flowing towards Australia right now. So that's why it's been a wet late spring and a very wet summer so far. And that's probably not going to ease up anytime soon, which sucks because I will be in Jervis Bay by the time that this is being recorded. But Ant, can you tell me what being in this period actually means?
Well, what it means is as you said, there's all this moist air flowing towards Australia. It means a lot of rain, in a word. Look, in November, there are a lot of places in southeast Australia that had their wettest Novembers on record. Canberra was one such place.
Wow.
And, you know, the Murrumbidgee River flows past Canberra, so all the rivers were absolutely up. I grew up swimming in the Murrumbidgee. I love the Murrumbidgee River. And, you know, the Lachlan River, all of those rivers of sort of southern and central New South Wales. Look, there was some terrible damage in some towns. There was some flood damage. It was bad news. But all of this water that flowed in these rivers was very, very good news for the health of the rivers and for the health of the animals and the plants that depend on the rivers, especially down in the wetlands. Now, I don't know if you know, I really want to set this scene, Elfie. But,
I'm listening.
Okay.
Give me the atmosphere. Give me the noise.
Well, we
happening
all
here.
know that Australia's longest river is the Murray. And I wonder how long till it gets an Indigenous name, because we spoke about the Macquarie River recently, didn't we?
Oh,
that
yeah,
in New South Wales,
yeah.
that is
The Womble.
The Womble, as it's going to be called. I wonder how long the Murray will be the Murray for. Separate story. We all know the Murray is Australia's longest river. The Murrumbidgee is second. Not many people know that. The Darling is third and the Lachlan is fourth. So we are talking about the second and fourth longest rivers in Australia. The Murrumbidgee and the Lachlan, both of them about 1,400 kilometres. Extremely significant rivers, having the best flood in years. Thanks, La Niña. Now, what's happening to all that water, Elfie? It is flowing downstream into the wetlands at the end of those rivers just before they meet the Murray. And these rivers don't really flow. The Lachlan flows into the Murrumbidgee and the Murrumbidgee flows into the Murray, but they don't really flow into it. They sort of just die and peter out in the wetlands. And those wetlands are usually marshy, swampy places, few birds, bit of this, bit of that. But right now they are singing, they are humming. It is an absolute good news story, and I'm thrilled about it.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, La Niña, not great for my beach holiday, but great for the wetlands, apparently.
Exactly.
And I know that your attention was caught recently by a series of tweets from an ecologist called Matt Herring. And Matt was out capturing the sights and sounds of the wetland of Yanga National Park in Western New South Wales. And I know that he's an ecologist who leads a biodiversity research, education and conservation consultancy called Murray Wildlife. And I know that because, Ant, you wrote that down in the notes that I'm reading right now.
You're reading them so well.
Thank you so much. So few people understand the ecology of the Murray-Darling Basin better than Matt does, and I know that you spoke to him about his work this week. So let's pick up part of your interview with him and hear about the wetlands.
G'day, Ant. Look, I have the privilege of surveying wetlands and other habitats all around the Murray-Darling Basin, and I've had this great job for about 20 years, and over that time, I've enjoyed a few seasons just like this one, where I say, so many wetlands, so little time.
So tell us about this season. It's been a wonderful season. I can see that just from your social media feed on Twitter and beyond. With the La Niña, we've had so much rain, so much flooding, and that's been bad news in certain places where the floods have caused damage. But downstream in the wetlands, it's good news, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, Ant. It's a time for renewal, and there's lots of water bird and frog and other animal breeding just as we speak. I'm just back from a trip around Balranald and in that region with Oxley and Maud, where the Lachlan River meets the Murrumbidgee. And I had the privilege of going deep into parts of Yanga National Park and onto private properties that surround that area. And yeah, I've just been blown away, Ant. There are literally thousands upon thousands of water birds breeding, from great crested grebes to little egrets and black swans and great cormorants. The list goes on. It's just a spectacular season.
That's fantastic. And just tell me and the listeners, where do these water birds come from? I know some are migratory, but how do they know the water is there, and where have some of them come from?
It's good. It's a good question, and we're just starting to get a handle on that. There's a great satellite tracking program with CSIRO led by Heather McGuinness, and she's been focusing on ibis and spoonbills, and they can go as far as North Queensland during the off times, and they come back. I mean, look, there's some talk of species like pelicans sending out scouts, but you just got to remember these birds, they don't live in houses like we do. They're constantly out there assessing the landscape, and they have a pretty incredible mental map of where different wetlands are, and you know which ones might be suitable at certain times. And so that knowledge is passed on from generation to generation when younger birds are led by older ones. And there's also this innate, like, genetic navigation. They just have this hardwired knowledge of where to go that we're still kind of getting a handle on that.
So obviously the how is not explainable, but the why is obvious. The why is, hooray, it's rained. Tell us a tiny bit more about the what. What else have you seen there in the wetlands? Maybe talk about frogs, fish. You tell me.
Look, down there in the low Bidgee, it's a very, very special part of the Murray-Darling Basin. There's really large expanses of tall spike rush, for example, which has been grazed out or otherwise lost from altered flooding regimes in other parts, a lot of other parts of the Murray-Darling Basin. But out there's thousands of hectares of it. There's huge Phragmites and Kumbungi reed beds, and those gorgeous old river red gums. That is where a lot of the water birds are nesting, in the rushes and reeds and in the red gums. And my work recently there has been with the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, also working with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. So these wetlands have been receiving environmental water, so they're primed, you know, they're ready to boom when you get a huge natural flood like this. And one of the key species that I've been chasing, Ant, is the Australasian bittern, which is the bunyip bird. It is.
Why is it called the bunyip?
It is a water bird. Yes, and it eats frogs and fish, and there's plenty of those in the low Bidgee, including some tiny little threatened fish like rainbow fish and little carp gudgeons, and the southern bell frog that sounds a bit like a motorbike warming up. And they're all out there. They're all part of the system. And these sneaky bunyip birds, the Australasian bitterns, take take a lot of special effort to find. We've been slogging it through the spike rush and in the water in kayaks, and we're hooked up with a really helpful yabby fisherman, and we've been getting into places that people apparently haven't been in for 20 years. So it's been a real privilege.
So
That is such a fantastic story, and I absolutely loved hearing that. And I have to say, like, I've learnt more about the Australian like wildlife and like ecology since like chatting with you than I have, I swear to God, in 28 years of my life so far. And it's always such a pleasure to hear about. So thank you very much for that. But, you know, so the wetlands are in flood, as Matt was saying, and that is fantastic news. But I'm wondering, I guess, we're generally a pretty dry country. So is this a brief glimmer of hope? And what happens to the health of the Murray-Darling Basin when the flow slows down to a trickle again or into complete drought, I guess?
that's a great question. And look, that's exactly really why I was so keen to speak to Matt Herring, because, you know, Matt Herring this week, when he caught my attention, as he said in the intro, he was just floating on a boat down through Yanga National Park on wetlands that, as he's just described there in the first part of that interview, are absolutely booming at the moment. But Matt works the river. He actually has a consultancy, as he said in the intro. It is a biodiversity research, education and conservation consultancy. It's called Murray Wildlife. Basically what he does is he goes around and talks to farmers. He's been to almost 1,000 farms, and he talks to them about how to make their properties sustainable, so that if you're growing whatever, pasture for dairy, rice, whatever they grow along the Murray and Murrumbidgee and all the great rivers, he is the guy to talk to about how to make your property also terrific for wildlife as well, so that you're giving as well as producing. Let's take a listen to the second half of the interview.
I think it's unfortunate that the Murray-Darling Basin is often portrayed as being destroyed, because there still are these highly significant and valuable systems remaining, and there's a lot we can do to make them even better.
And that is a terrific, and that's great to hear, by the way, but that's a terrific segue over to your work. Now, you proudly list that you've worked with 950 plus farms. I'm sure you're going to hit the 1,000 mark soon. You can raise the bat 10 times like they do in cricket for making 100. And you've worked with farmers on establishing sort of sound ecological practices on their own land so that they can farm, I understand, in a better way, and they can also set aside, for example, making their dams friendly for water birds by planting a few reeds or doing other things like that. Long story short, you help make farming in the Murray-Darling Basin more ecologically friendly. Is that about a good summary?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a real kick out of doing this for the past couple of decades, and I think it's a huge part of the way forward in preventing extinctions and having more sustainable landscapes. And I love working alongside farmers. I think they're some of the people that are most in touch with nature as custodians, and most willing to do more to protect it.
There are two schools of thought on that. Some people see farmers as environmental vandals and some see them as custodians, to use the word you just said. Is there some resistance? Do these people come to you or do you go to them?
It's a bit of both. And look, there certainly are people out there that couldn't care less, and it's all about profit. But more and more people are, producing food and fibre, and also wanting to conserve the environment at the same time. And this space it's a really exciting one. Like, if you think of water, big issue in the Murray-Darling Basin, it's very polarized at present. You've got water for agriculture and the economy, and then you've got water for the environment. But there are potential areas in the middle ground where we can sort of maximize mutual benefits. And so there's some really interesting things that myself and others are looking at going forward.
All right, before we go, give me one example. Tell me about a farm that maybe didn't look so good, looked a bit barren, wasn't really in keeping with the way that the riverine landscape should look, and maybe talk about that farm and how you helped change it.
Look, the best example I think I can give is with rice farming, which is down in the Riverina, in the southern part of the Murray-Darling Basin. A lot of people are really opposed to rice and cotton because it uses a lot of water. But what is often misunderstood is that the irrigators are allocated a certain amount of water each year, and whether they grow almonds or pasture for dairy, it doesn't really matter. They'll use the same amount of water. So they grow what makes money. And I'm fortunate, I'm grateful that rice is still one of those, because it creates a wetland habitat. It's like a swamp. And some of our most threatened water birds are in there, and frogs, the painted snipe, the bittern, the bell frogs. And so by working alongside rice farmers, we can tweak their agronomy and the way they grow the crop to incorporate the habitat requirements of these birds and frogs and other wildlife. So that's one example of how you can produce food and conserve biodiversity at the same time.
I never thought of that, and I have to slap the table. I'm so thrilled by that piece of knowledge, Matt, that of course a rice paddy, if we call it that here, is a wetland, and
yes,
you can use that wetland. I mean, it's a functioning wetland while the rice is growing, and I'm presuming you say you can tweak it slightly. You mean perhaps you can plant some appropriate reeds or something at various ends of the rice crop, or other native plants that more suit the wildlife. I assume you mean something like that.
Yeah, that's one of the things, and some of the others are, avoiding herbicide use on banks. So you have these nice grassy banks providing extra habitat. We can manage adjacent refuges next to the rice field so that there's habitat after harvest time, and also get the ponding period right, the commencement of the flooding, so that it suits the requirements for breeding. And the rice farmers are on board with this. I mean, they've seen all the birds and heard all the frogs in their crops for decades, and so they appreciate the recognition, but also the ability to to seize that opportunity and basically help take the lead on some of these threatened species recoveries.
I absolutely loved what he was saying there, because I think that in Australia we're sold the narrative that to participate in agriculture is to be the enemy of the local environment. And I just don't think that's true most of the time. Like, farmers have a great love for the wildlife that surrounds them and the environments that they occupy. And that is the most incredible story about the way that you can actually adapt to, be the friend of the natural wildlife and the animals around.
And that's exactly what I hope, I hoped you and others would get out of that interview, Alfie. And I hope that's what everyone gets out of the Green Canary's existence going forward in 2022, because we know there's a lot of doom and gloom in the environmental sphere. We know there are some bad stories. We know there are water rorts and all sorts of terrible things going on in the Murray-Darling Basin, to use that area. We know that too much water sucked out of the river for the wrong purposes does not do the environment any favours. But we also know that we can mitigate and we can solve these problems. And Matt Herring is just your example of a guy who's out there helping people make a living and helping people make a difference. That is exactly what we're all about. And so I wanted to sort of end 2021 and look to 2022 as you're listening to this podcast. Perhaps it's in the new year already, and have that as a bit of a blueprint for the vibe and the content that the Green Canary wants to bring.
I absolutely love that, Ant. Thank you so much for that interview. It was brilliant. And thank you, audience, for tuning into the Green Canary. We will be taking a short break. I believe we'll be off for 1 or 2 weeks, depending on how sleepy we are. Yeah. But before we head off today, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Elfie.
Bye.
Bye.